Thank you. Thank you. Afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm Nick Mothershaw from the Open Identity Exchange. I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about credentials and wallets and what they need to do if they're actually going to be useful to us. And the title of my presentation here is Smart Digital ID. So I'm going to talk about what is a Smart Digital ID. And it's more than just a digital wallet with digital credentials stuffed in it. But I'll kick off with a little bit about who I am and what we do. So the Open Identity Exchange is a not-for-profit members organisation. All of our members, you can see them, or some of them listed on the screen here, share a common vision. And that vision is that we can all of us, have digital identities that we can use anywhere around the world. So when I arrive here in the US, I have a digital identity and it works. It's fully interoperable and it's trusted. This has been our vision for a long time. This isn't new for OAX. We've been on this road a good 10 years. And it's interesting that now we're all getting to this same position. And listening to the opening address yesterday, it was brilliant to see that it was talking about the credentials and binding and digital identity and the wallets and how that's moving forward. So that's our mission. And one of the things we want you to do is to join us in this mission and the vision. What are we trying to do? So this is a picture of my wallet and my partner's purse. So we tend to use the word wallet. My partner uses the word purse. What do we call it? It's a collection of real-world credentials. And at the moment, it tends to be payment cards, loyalty cards, our driving licenses, maybe put in there our national ID cards. It's not all the credentials we hold. And as we move to a digital world, the capabilities of digital identity will be more and broader than these wallets today. And as you can see, these are already messy. It's full of bits of paper, it's got some cash in it as well. So actually to manage my life in my wallet as it stands is tough enough. And as I use this, I intuitively know how it works, because that's been built into my head from birth. As soon as I had money, I had a wallet. As soon as I had a credit card, I kept it in my wallet. We've matured the way these things are used to contactless payment, so that all of this works for us conveniently. As we move to digital versions, we cannot go backwards. It's not acceptable that we go backwards. We have to, as we digitize, move forwards. And we haven't done a very good job of that recently. So you hear lots of people talking about how COVID's pushed us forward, and it has. It's pushed digitization forward maybe 10 years. But it was a mess, wasn't it? If we were traveling, so I traveled to Germany last year, and I traveled to Thailand earlier this year, really painful. I had to fill in application forms before I went, passenger locator forms to say where I was going to be, get tests, get secure rides in Thailand from where I was landing to where I was staying, have that accommodation booked, have medical insurance of the correct amount that specifically had the right clauses for COVID in it. So for me to assemble all of this was really tricky. And it took me, the Thailand one actually took me about 3 hours to put all of mine together and put it into the system. And it took me about an hour and a half to do my partners after I'd worked out what I was doing. People say it was taking hours and hours. I'm pretty good at this kind of stuff. People cognitively can't deal with this amount of rules and questions. And with Digital ID, we have an opportunity to solve that problem for them. And we're starting to digitize credentials. So this is happening already. But what happens if we simply do that and shove them all in their own app? What happens if my driver vehicle license agency gives me a driving license in its own app? My bank gives me my payment cards in their own app. My credentials about my education, about my COVID tests come in their own app. So if I've got to then present these as I'm going through an airport, or I've got to open several different apps, I've got to navigate them, I've got to put all that together. I've got to put all of that together myself. The same way as I do with paper today, but now I've got to do it electronically on a device which is fiddly. So is that better? Is the digitization better? So what if we put them all in one place? What if we put them all in one wallet? So this thing now that says Digital ID on it with a credential in it, that could be a wallet, a digital wallet. That's a great step forward. They're now all in one place, all in a common tool. They probably all look similar, but they've got their own branding, so I can differentiate them. So I've made a great step now, and it's similar to the real world. I've got them all in my wallet. And I've got things in here that don't go in my wallet that are carried around all the time, like my education credentials, but they're there when I need them. So that's a great step forward. It's more secure than me carrying my wallet with lots of different bits around, as long as it's secured properly. I'll come on to that in a moment. It's certainly more sustainable. I haven't got bits of paper and bits of plastic. It's all in one device. You can argue about the sustainability of the device, but I've got that anyway. It's probably easier to manage, probably, if we design it well. But it might actually be more difficult, and particularly for people who are a bit more digitally challenged, it might not be an improvement on the paper they use today. But as we want to digitize and we want to move forward, we need to make that possible. We need to do more than this. It's not good enough for us to create wallets and stuff them full of digitized version of the real world. It's a massive step forward, but we can do better than that as an identity industry. We've got to be smart. So let me kind of build up what a smart digital ID looks like. So first off, it's got to be secure. So I've introduced some authenticators in my box in here. So I've got a wallet. It's got to be secured with the right kind of authenticators for the right kind of credentials. They've got to be bound together. We saw on the intro yesterday, around binding at the start of the process where the user is bound to their identity. This binding happens all the time as we bring in new credentials and we refresh them. So here I've simply got a passport, and with that, I can get on a plane. I can answer the question of the airline. I want to check in for my flight. Well, do you have a passport? Yes, I do. There you go. And that's that simple digital step, simple real-world interaction. That gets a lot more complicated, though. And sometimes it gets complicated in ways where you wouldn't expect it to. So what if I want to buy alcohol or prove I'm COVID safe? So to buy alcohol, I probably have to be over a certain age, 18, 21, depending on where I am. Again, I need to answer the question for the organisation to their rules. And their rules may be set by them, they may be set by their regulator, but the rules of organisations will vary. And the digital ID has got to understand those rules. So I've now got these rules coming into a rules engine, which I've introduced in the digital ID. This is what makes it smart. It can take the rules, interpret them, and work out on behalf of the user how to fulfill the rules. So with my first example here, if I've got my passport and you want to have I'm over 18, the rules around the digital ID with data minimization can say, yeah, I can extract that from a passport and I can present that to the organization. I only need to show that I'm 18 and maybe my picture so they can cross-check it's actually me. Data minimized approach. If I want to check in for my flight, and another question might be, are you COVID safe? That's a more complex question. I don't want to deal with the complexity. I find it difficult to understand the rules, and the rules change everywhere I go. The digital ID, the smart digital ID and smart wallet should be able to understand those rules and help me through the process. If I've got vaccinations, it needs to work out that they're the right kind of ones. If I've got to have a test and it's in my wallet, great. If it's not, it needs to connect me with somewhere I can get the tests of the right kind. So I'm not expecting the smart digital ID to do that itself, but it needs to have relationships and outreach to issuers of credentials in a smart way, again, to help the user through all of this process. And the rules are complex. The rules for over 18, you might think are simple. But when you actually think that through and say, well, actually, I want a date of birth from a credential, but my rules say it must have come from a government-issued authoritative source, so that narrows down the ones I can use. It couldn't be created by a third party, as long as it comes from a government authoritative source, so I've got that rule. It must contain an image of the person, because I want to cross-check that. It must have been checked against the user's own self-image when it was created and bound in the right way, so I'm sure that this is the user. And that binding must be with two strong authenticators, so that I can't give it to somebody else. It's got my photo on it, and I can't reveal it with a passport. So if I've got someone who looks like me, I can't pass that across. It's got to have stronger authenticators. And it must be checked to see if it's been lost, stolen, or has been used for fraud. So that simple question over 18 suddenly has quite a complex set of rules for its fulfillment, and they may vary by organisation. COVID safe, I need a vaccine of a certain type, I need a test of a certain type that's been done in a certain time window and by a certain kind of agency. And so bringing all those things together again, another example of rules. AML, another example of complex rules around, I needed one document, but it's going to be this kind of document, and another document, and it can't be from this list of documents. So people have these lists of acceptable documents that need to be combined. So the digital ID needs to understand this and help the user through it. And it needs to let me access the organizations I'm dealing with again and again. So in the same way as I use my Google ID, Apple ID, Facebook ID, through OpenID Connect today to log on, my digital ID should do this for me. So once I've opened an account, I can use that account again with a digital ID if the organization wishes. This is a bit of a shift for a lot of organizations to make, handing out the keys to the door. But they're handed out in a secure way, and they're stored as access credentials in the digital ID. And these could be physical access credentials to open gates to go into offices and doors. They could be tickets for events. They could be boarding cards. So the digital ID needs to store those and then enable me to present them back to the issuer who gave them to me to prove that I am entitled to do something with them. I used to do all of those things. So if I bring all of that together, what I've now got is my digital ID, smart digital ID, smart wallet, with a rules engine that can interpret the rules of organizations. And they're going to change, maybe for individual organizations, and it needs to be clever enough to interpret that. It's got to have the right kind of authenticators to meet the rules and be secure. It needs to host my digitized real-world credentials. Remember, that's where I started. Just doing that is not good enough. It's got to do all the rest of this as well. It's got to be able to derive other things from them. We call those derived credentials that come from the digitized credentials. And it might store those for reuse. Once it's worked out I'm over 18, that's not going to change. A lot of my other derived credentials are point in time and need to be re-derived every time I need to use that credential. And then my access credentials as well. So it needs to bring all of these things together. That's when it gets smart. That's when it gets useful. And that's what we've got to do for organizations and users if we're going to make digital identity a success. It's our duty as a community to do that. And at OAX, we're working as a community to drive this vision forward. We just released our trust framework for smart digital IDs. Released that earlier in the year. We're continuing to evolve that. And we're now influencing in ecosystems like this, to governments, to tech providers, to achieve this vision. And you've heard me call it quite a few things. I'm using the term smart digital ID, but it could be a smart wallet, it could be a smart agent. The UD wallets, the EU digital wallets, are going to be smart. If you read the requirement specification that came out, there are elements in there that mean the fulfillment of that has got to be smart. It's got to be able to data minimize. It implies it's got to be able to combine credentials. Combining is where this gets tricky. It's where the rules get complex, and it's where the digital ID itself has got to become an issuer or have a relationship with an agent that does that for it. So this is a pretty big shift from our thinking of just digitizing credentials to actually making something that works. And it's got to work not just for the rules of the organization. I have my rules. I might have a rule that says every time I walk into a 7-Eleven, I don't mind if my face is scanned and when I stand at the till, that is automatically proven that I'm 18. Because mostly when I go in there, I buy alcohol. It might not be every time, but actually I don't care. It's a convenience to me to do that. So I'm setting up a long-lasting consent. I might have to renew that from time to time, but there's many other ways users might set their own rules around the ID. So it's got to work for the user, it's got to work for the organization. So it's getting even more challenging now for it to be smart. It's got two people telling it what to do. It's got to work out its way through that. And actually this gets even more complicated. The digital ID will be operating in a legal framework. We call that a trust framework. And that's setting out the overall policies, approach to ID proofing, rules, assurance levels, data management requirements for the digital ID ecosystem as a whole. So it's putting rules that this smart digital ID has got to understand. We've already talked about the organization and their rules and the user and their rules. The people issuing credentials also have rules. Where can the credential be used? Where can it be shared? How long does it live for? What can be derived from it, or has it got to be presented in whole every time? The The digital ID has got to read all of this and make an interpretation on behalf of the user that makes the user's life easier, that meets the organization's rules. This is a smart digital ID. And we define the trust framework elements of how that works. So we've got a guide to trust frameworks. We're talking there about this concept of smart digital ID and what you need to do to create a framework to support that. We're evolving that, and we want your input. We want you to come and work with us to evolve this so we go on this journey together to make this an open and consistent approach that works around the globe. So I want to use my digital ID everywhere. I don't want, unless I choose, to have digital IDs in lots of different countries. I want to be able to reuse my digital ID. Now, if I become permanently resident somewhere, it's probably reasonable to expect me to have a digital ID in that country. But as I'm traveling around for business or shopping in the internet or in the metaverse, where I don't even understand where that is on this globe, it doesn't matter, I want my digital ID to work. And it needs to move, therefore, from framework to framework seamlessly. When I hop on a plane to come over here from the UK, my digital ID comes with me, probably on my phone or via my phone. When I land, my phone works out where it is and starts working and comes up with messages that tell me local rules, commercial rules. If you use data over here, this is what it's going to cost you. You've got this amount of data before the cost goes up. You can have free text. So I get that information because it's read the local rules and it's presenting them to me. So I want it to do the same thing for the digital ID. I want to land in the US and for there to be a framework here that's readable by my smart digital ID. And then it works actually, of all the credentials I've got in here, a whole bunch of them are already valid here in the US because they're done to a common standard. Driving licenses, common standard. Passports, common standard. Bank stuff, common standards. So instantly all of those work here. And then from that, I apply my local rules around something like levels of assurance. And maybe, if I'm lucky, I'm instantly a level of assurance in my destination country because I've got the right credentials to the right standards, and that can be worked out. And this, we're talking more about this afternoon, about the currency of identity. Is the currency of identity these things, levels of assurance? Is that how we're going to trade globally to explain how trusted we are? Or is that simply not going to work because that needs exchange rates and conversions? Are we going to have to drop back to credentials and reformulate levels of assurance in each country we go to? And again, that's something we want you to work with us to explore. And that's part of what we're doing for the Global Assured Identity Network. Taking an untrusted internet that's chaotic and it's got bad actors in it. There are already trusted networks all over the world emerging. They are trust frameworks that deliver safe, trustworthy, reusable digital identities to citizens. They come from governments, they come from private sector organizations. On behalf of the governments, they come in commercial form. They're already there. We want to make them interoperate. And where we're getting to is to make that happen, the digital identities are going to have to be pretty smart to navigate from one framework to another. Read the rules of the framework. That's what we're trying to define. How can that be communicated and just work simply as we move around the globe as global citizens? Or we sit in our living room in the metaverse and move around a brand new world. It's got to work in both contexts. In GAIN, there are 5 organizations who come together. OIX is looking at the governance, trust framework element. OIDF is looking at technical proof of concepts and connections. GLIFE is looking at who are the entities, the legal entities involved, and how to identify them and their roles. If we need a signature in there, Cloud Signature Consortium, bringing that angle into it. Most digital IDs are connected into e-signing capabilities. And there's a big play in here for finance, both in terms of, you saw bank cards as credentials, but also in terms of accepting digital IDs as we move around the globe. So we've got International Institute of Finance there. We're collaborating under an MOU to drive this vision forward. And again, we want you to join us. Either your organization or representatives from your organization to join us to drive this vision forward. So how can you help this vision? It's a vision that's been set by our members. It's a vision that's vital if digital identity is going to be successful. In the opening addresses in here in 2 or 3 years, I want people to be showing these smart digital IDs and how they work and how they adapt. I want that exhibition hall out there to be full of people who are manufacturing these things and competing to make them smarter, make the UXs better. That's what we want to see in this ecosystem. We're influencing that. We're defining how frameworks work. We're influencing the industry, both by bringing them together as a community and then thought leading on how this needs to evolve. We advocate for this vision. This is what we're doing today. We influence governments around how this vision needs to work. So join us. Come and be part of this community if you share this vision to help make it a reality. So that's it from me. I hope that's been useful. I hope you share that vision. As I've already said, we think it's vital if this is going to be a success. We've got a stand out in the exhibition hall if you want to come and find out more, or just ask me some questions now. So, really excited about helping drive this forward. A couple of questions here.